It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the RCA Evolution Premium. RCA, Radio Corporation of America, they're known for RCA cables, but until now they haven't been known for monitors, so it'll be interesting to see one of their first attempts. As usual for a video, be aware that what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. In the description of the video, you'll find links to additional video content related to this monitor, including a quicker review if you're not so interested in the technical details and data. You just want an idea of how the monitor performs. There's also information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 27-inch 2560 by 1440, that's 1440p or QHD resolution, and sports a 240Hz refresh rate. And more specifically, I believe it is an AU Optronics AHVA panel, so this is an IPS type panel. So the QHD resolution and the 27-inch screen size, it's quite a popular combination, gives a good amount of desktop real estate, pretty good pixel density, so it gives decent clarity to text, a decent level of detail to suitably high resolution image content, decent multitasking potential as well. So to use the native 2560 by 1440, you need to be connected via DisplayPort 1.4. There are various other refresh rates listed, as you can see here. The output color depth is a maximum of 8 bits per channel. Now, most people don't really have to worry about this because most content under SDR is 8-bit anyway. And under HDR, the GPU uses a dithering stage which works very well. I've compared this side by side on various monitors before, with the GPU handling the dithering and the monitor handling the signal itself to get the 10 bits. And the visual results are extremely similar. If you wanted to use a 10-bit signal, so making sure the monitor's handling everything itself, that would be in SDR and HDR, then you can run the monitor at 200Hz or below, and that becomes an option. Via HDMI, you're restricted to 144Hz maximum, and that will be 8 bits per channel. If you want 10 bits or even 12 bits, you have to run at 75Hz or below at the native resolution. Be aware that this monitor doesn't include a 4K UHD downsampling mode, meaning it won't accept a 4K UHD signal. That's something to be aware of for games console users, for example. And because it's only HDMI 2.0, which is why the refresh rate was limited to 144Hz max at the native resolution, there's no HDMI 2.1 VRR support either. Although you can use adaptive sync, so that means you can use AMD FreeSync via HDMI and DisplayPort, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort. You can also use HDR at the same time as VRR on this monitor. Just a few more points to note here before moving on. If you're considering the interpolation or the scaling performance of the monitor, so you're running the full HD and the monitor's doing its scaling, which it can do at up to 120Hz, there is a moderate softness. It certainly doesn't have the kind of sharpness you'd get from a native full HD resolution on a 27-inch screen. There's a sharpness control on the monitor. If you up that at all, just one notch to 60 instead of the default of 50, then it really significantly over-sharpens the image. It gives quite an artificial over-sharpened look, which isn't really a very good solution. So what I would say is if you're a PC user and you want to be using the monitor at a non-native resolution, or you have to for certain applications or games or for whatever reason, performance reasons generally, then just use GPU scaling. That'll give you a decent experience and just keep the sharpness at the default of 50. And with GPU scaling, you could also run the monitor at its native 240Hz. Of course, for games console users, you can't use GPU scaling, so do be aware of these limitations with the monitor's own scaling process. The other thing to be aware of, I sometimes comment on something which I like to call dynamic interlace pattern artifacts. Some people will call them scan lines or inversion artifacts. And the dynamic interlace pattern artifacts specifically, they would be sort of dancing lines, I like to call them. It can look like shades are broken up into a fine pattern alternating between a slightly lighter and darker variant of the shade. You can see them on some monitors when you simply scan your eye in a certain way, or you're observing movement on the screen. On some backgrounds it can be more noticeable than others with some shade combinations. On this model, I'm pleased to say that I didn't have any particular issue with this. Even running the monitor at 60Hz, it really wasn't something that jumped out at me like they do on some models, so that was good to see, or indeed not see. I'm now going to look at the external features of the monitor. So matte black for most of it, the stand and the bottom bezel. There's also a little bright red plastic ring in the middle for a little bit of visual contrast. The stand is fairly deep and also fairly broad. It's a bit of a desk depth hog compared to some designs. It's around 13 inches deep from the rearmost point to the frontmost point, and this screen sits a few inches back from the frontmost point of the stand. So really the screen's going to be at least 10 inches from the wall if you're using the included stand. The one has the common dual stage bezel design, so there's a slim hard plastic outer component as well as a panel border which is slender and is flush with the rest of the screen. It blends in nicely when the screen is switched off. Clearer to see when the screen is switched on as it is elsewhere in the video. This model has what I would classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface, so you can see a sharp glare patch there. That's because there is strong direct light striking the screen surface there. So if you are sitting in a particularly bright room or you have strong direct light striking the screen surface, you can get this sort of what I would call a glassy quality, these sharper glare patches. It isn't like the reflections you might get on a glossy screen surface, but it doesn't diffuse the light as heavily as some matte screen surfaces, as stronger matte screen surfaces. So that means the glare handling isn't as strong as some matte screen surfaces, although it's still decent, but it also means that it avoids strong diffusion of light across the screen surface, which hazes the image up. So it's good that that's avoided. You just have to be careful with the stronger light. But I would say the same about any screen surface. You really ideally do not want to be sitting in the kind of conditions I am now just to demonstrate the screen surface. It's a bright room, uncontrolled lighting, lots of strong light striking the screen surface directly. At the rear, mainly matte black plastic, there are the LED lighting features. There's a little strip there and the same at the other side. And it just cycles through various different colours. You can't customise it in any way. It just is or isn't if you have it disabled. So very simple. A few glossy black plastic elements as well. The included stand offers tilt, height and pivot adjustment, and you can pivot it clockwise or anti-clockwise into portrait orientation. As a general point about the stand, it's not the most solid stand design. It's all plasticky. I prefer metal, especially on a product which has premium in the name. And I also find that the screen attachment to the stand is a little bit on the wobbly side. You don't generally notice it. I know you don't generally tend to tap the monitor or shake the monitor when you're just using it normally, but when you're using the OSD, which is here, it does have a bit of wobble to it. It certainly isn't the worst stand I've felt in this respect. It doesn't feel super cheap or anything like that. It's just, I do personally prefer a more solid stand design and screen attachment. There's also a cable tidy loop at the bottom there. It's a little cable management feature. The screen attaches centrally with a quick release mechanism, so you push that catch up and you can detach the screen, and that will reveal provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. The port labels, they're quite nice and clear actually. I like the way they've done this. Sometimes they're just engraved into the plastic and it's difficult to see, but these ones are quite clear with silver wording or lettering. So there's a DC power input, so it uses an external power brick, two USB 3.2 Gen 1 downstream ports and Type B upstream, two HDMI 2.0 ports and DisplayPort 1.4. There's also a Type C port. It has a generous 90 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort alt mode and upstream data, so the monitor does have KVM functionality, so you can easily reassign connected USB peripherals to multiple systems using the Type C upstream and the USB-B upstream port, and there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There's also a K slot, and there are integrated speakers, stereo speakers, so there's one there, one there. Just a note on these speakers, they offer reasonable sound output. It's not particularly good quality, but it's not the worst I've heard either. I didn't find the volume control particularly good. They didn't go particularly loud, and they didn't go very quiet either. So I think the volume control itself could have been a bit better, a bit more flexible. They're there if you need to use them, but don't expect anything amazing. The subpixels of this monitor, they're standard RGB stripe, red, green and blue. There isn't anything funky going on, so there are no subpixel related issues to worry about in terms of text clarity. As a Windows user, you may wish to run through the clear type wizard. That's all just according to preferences. This is a very standard layout, and there weren't any subpixel related issues with fringing or static interlace patterns or anything like that that I observed. I'll be looking now at the calibration of the monitor. So this table here gives a few different conditions I tested with. So user factory default, the gamma average 2.1 and the white point was 7958K with a green push as well. So that means that the image looks very cool tinted and also has a green tint. So this does deviate from my usual targets I'd go for, which is a gamma of 2.2, 6500K white point and a nice neutral green channel. There are a few different color temperature settings. Setting that to normal, it doesn't do an awful lot to the white point, but it does get rid of the green push, neutralizes that green channel quite nicely. There's a warm setting, and that isn't actually warm. It's just warmer than the factory defaults. It's still over 7000K. And there's an sRGB setting, which is not an sRGB emulation setting. There's no clamping of the gamut going on here. It's just another color temperature setting. And that sets it to closer to 6500K, although there is a green push. So for my test settings, and you can see what I've done there in the bottom table, there's also an exploration of this in the best settings video and in the OSD video, which the best settings video is just a part of, and you'll find a link to the OSD video in the description of the video if you're interested. But these were the changes I made to get things on target according to my own preferences and my colorimetric targets. So you can see I reduced the brightness and I made some changes to the color channels. Have FreeSync set to on, the overdrive set to the middle setting, and the refresh rate for most of the review was set to 240 Hz. As noted at the bottom there are some ICC profiles which you'll find in the description of the video. I didn't use these in the reviews, but I did create them because I know some people like to use them. And they can be useful, for example, to give gamut mapping data if you're using color-aware applications or ICC-aware applications, that kind of thing. So I know some people do like to use them, and they're there if you want to have a play with them. So looking at the gamma now in a bit more detail, with my test settings and gamma set to 2.2, that's on the monitor, the gamma setting of the monitor, it has a gamma setting. It has a 2.1 average gamma. With the gamma set to 2.4 on the monitor, it averages 2.3. So which of these you'd prefer? Neither is 2.2. One is too high, one is too low. It's really a matter of preference. But what I would say is that with the default 2.2 setting, I felt this was the best balanced. And it's not obvious from the resolution of these graphs, but actually for the very dark shades, it was quite close to 2.2. So it had an appropriate level of dark detail, which was good to see. It's just really for the mid-tones where the gamma's a bit low. So that means that some shades are a bit brighter than they should be. I'd say overall this wasn't a massive issue for the sort of general purpose use of the monitor, gaming and on the desktop, that kind of thing. And it's not a huge deviation anyway. And with the wide gamut as well, it sort of introduces quite a bit of extra vibrancy in places as well. So I would say that overall I would stick to the default setting, but have a play, see what works for you. And I'm going to focus on the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor. So this table here shows the maximum brightness recorded on this monitor, 416 nits. The minimum brightness recorded, 26 nits. So that's a good brightness adjustment range, decent bright maximum and a nice low minimum. The maximum contrast recorded was 1156. Yes, there is less than 1300 there, but that isn't an accurate figure, which is why it has the less than symbol. And that's because the black depth is so low, and with the precision of the, or lack of precision of the colorimeter, you can't really get a nice accurate reading there with such a low black depth. Using the MPRT setting, which is a strobe backlight setting of the monitor, I recorded 104 nits, and you can't change the brightness using this setting, so you're stuck with that. My test settings, as you'll recall from before, there were some significant adjustments made there to the colour channels, and that did drop the contrast, so it's down to 939 to 1. To be honest, that's pretty close to the specified 1000 to 1. The contrast on this monitor is quite typical for an IPS model. Yes, some are a bit stronger and some are a bit weaker. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider now, and I'm going to explore contrast performance using some in-game examples. So yeah, the static contrast isn't incredible, as I've explored already. There's also IPS glow to contend with, so there's a bit of a sort of fogginess, a haze emanating from the corners of the screen. From a normal viewing position, you'd see that more strongly towards the bottom corners of the screen, with an ergonomically correct viewing position, if you like to call it that. Your eyes will be a little bit above the centre of the screen, in other words. And the IPS glow tends to have a slightly golden or warmer tint towards the right side and cooler towards the left. And because of that, I'd say that at the left side, it's generally a bit more noticeable. IPS glow can also be brought out more strongly if your unit has an issue with backlight bleed or clouding. Mine's actually very good in that respect. Only very minor issues towards the extreme edges and during normal use of the monitor, for example. But yes, that can vary between units. Also, if you're sitting closer to the monitor or using a higher brightness setting, that will increase IPS glow. A positive of this monitor and other IPS models is strong gamma consistency. So that means there's a certain level of detail. Yes, there's loss because of IPS glow and in the regions affected by IPS glow, but in general, there's a certain consistent level of detail which is superior to what you get on other LCD panel types. So there isn't a sort of gradient vertically as you get with TN, a detail gradient for dark shades, which can look very odd. And there isn't what you get with VA models where there's black crush centrally and things can be too masked, and peripherally you can have things too unmasked, basically unintended details revealed. So there's none of that going on. More consistent in that respect. I've now brightened the room up a bit, so yes, you can see some glare on the screen in places, but you become less aware of the less than incredible static contrast and also the IPS glow. It just doesn't catch the eye in the same way. And with all this in mind, I would recommend if you sit in a mainly dark room or you like to sit in dimmer lighting, consider having some light behind the monitor, like a bias light, just to help illuminate and give a pool of light behind the monitor. That can just help enhance the perceived contrast if the rest of the room's dim. It can also improve viewing comfort, so it's something I would recommend looking into. And looking at those brighter shades and just think about the screen surface, the light, very light matte anti-glare means that there isn't a lot of layering in front of the image. There isn't obvious graininess either. There's a little bit of what I'd call light misty graininess, but it's light enough that most people won't really notice it. So it isn't sort of a smeary or heavy graininess. It doesn't have an obvious, very sandy look as some matte screen surfaces do. Yes, there isn't the same kind of direct emission of light you get from a glossy screen surface, but it at least comes a bit closer to that than some matte screen surfaces do. I'm now on Lagom, lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles, and I'm going to talk about colour consistency. So, as an IPS type panel, as I've mentioned with respect to contrast, it has strong gamma consistency, and that also is reflected when you're looking at colours or considering the colour performance and what a shade looks like centrally versus peripherally. The Lagom text test appears with the red striping throughout, but it's pretty consistent. There aren't obvious flashes between orange and green and other shades. So that indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block, I was looking at the screen when I said that because it always seems to look odd on the video preview screen and in the video in general. Looks like there's a big pink ball. You don't see that to the eye. It's quite a consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen. It is a little bit of a darker shade towards the very edges of the screen, but there isn't the kind of transition you can see on the video. The red block appears a good rich red throughout the screen. The green block appears yellowish green chartreuse throughout the screen, very slightly yellower towards the extreme edges, but that has more to do with the panel border, and it's quite common on models with this dual stage design for the bezels as this has, and with most monitors these days. It's only a minor thing in this case. The blue block appears royal blue throughout the screen. I'm on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So the strong consistency I talked about on Lagom is also a thing on games. A given shade therefore appears very similar whether it's displayed centrally, peripherally, or elsewhere on the screen. The game is running in SDR, and like most SDR content, whether you're on the desktop or you're playing a game, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. That's the standard colour space. That's what the S means in sRGB. And if you're using a gamut on the monitor which goes beyond that, then it can invite extra vibrancy and saturation. And therefore some elements have a level of vibrancy and vividness that goes beyond the intentions of the developer. In this case, I measured 96% DCI-P3, so a lot of extension beyond sRGB, and even some extension beyond DCI-P3 for the green to blue region. For those interested, I measured 92% Adobe RGB, so not full Adobe RGB coverage. Adobe RGB has more coverage for the green to blue edge. But either way, a generous gamut here. So the sky blues have a lot of pop beyond what's intended. Some of the green shades have too much pop as well. These foresty greens don't look as deep as they should. They look a bit bright, a little bit overdone. These aren't too bad. So some examples of shades which appear a bit more noticeably sort of bright and overdone. But none of the shades really have the same kind of look they would on a monitor with even more generous Adobe RGB coverage, where some of the greens can look really cartoonish and almost neon, I find. So at least it doesn't go that far. You might recall there's lots of extension in the red region as well, and that can give some browns an overly rich appearance. It can bring out reds and oranges too strongly, so the bark of the tree here has a bit of an orangey look, or not as neutral as it should look. And this can apply to skin tones as well. They tend to have an overly rich look and sometimes a bit of a reddish cast, but not too strong in this respect. I have seen a stronger sort of sunburnt look on some monitors to skin tones. The oranges of the crash barriers here as well, the reds of these flaming barrels, or they're now flaming barrels because I shot them, and the red of the explosion. The fire looks nice and vibrant. Some good rich oranges, yellows, reds, etc. Usually at this point I would talk about an sRGB emulation setting on the monitor which you can activate to tone things down, but this monitor doesn't actually have one of those. It does have a colour temperature setting called sRGB, but that is not an sRGB emulation setting. If you want to achieve sRGB emulation on this one, it's a little bit complicated. There is an article all about sRGB emulation on the website, and I've linked to that in the description of the video. And there's a tool mentioned there from NVIDIA. If you use the default settings, which should be similar if you're using the little AMD tweak that I talk about for AMD GPU users, then it only very slightly reduces the gamut because the information on the EDID in this case, which is used by these tools, or the NVIDIA No Video sRGB tool and the AMD graphics driver, it doesn't seem to use very good data. You can feed the NVIDIA tool better data by loading in an ICC profile, such as the one that I've created on the monitor, and again it's linked to in the video description. And as mentioned in the article, the idea there is not to actually use the profile at the same time, it's just to feed the tool data, such as gamut mapping data, and therefore the tool can make more accurate corrections. So the idea is you load the profile in, you don't have the profile active, but the tool can make better corrections. It's all explored in the article. Anyway, by doing this, I measured 99% sRGB coverage with really good sRGB tracking, as you'd hope, given the data is a lot more accurate now. So that is sRGB emulation, and that applies on games such as this as well. I'm just going to enable that tool just so you can have a little bit of a visual comparison between things looking as they do natively with the native gamut as they do at the moment versus with sRGB emulation. So hopefully you can see now that things just look more muted overall. The sky blues look more appropriate, less of a vivid look to the greens, they look arguably more appropriate, and just generally tones things down. And now if you're using this monitor for colour critical work, remember there's 96% DCI-P3 coverage, but there is a bit of extension beyond DCI-P3. If you're wanting to do content creation within the DCI-P3 space, then ideally you'd have greater DCI-P3 coverage, but you'd also really want no extension or very little extension beyond DCI-P3. And for Adobe RGB, you've got 92% coverage, so you do have a bit missing there. And for sRGB, well, you've got a lot of over coverage. So really, I would recommend, and this is ideal with any monitor, but certainly in this case, to calibrate the monitor using your own colorimeter or similar device. Again, there are profiles you can use for gamut mapping, which will sort of roughly work, but it is best to make corrections on your own unit and with your own hardware where possible, because units can vary a little bit in this respect and how they're set up. But even so, ICC profiles are there if you want to use them, and they can feed some extra information to color-aware applications. And you also have to be aware that the strong colour consistency works in the monitor's favour in terms of colour accuracy as well, with a given shade appearing similar regardless of its on-screen position. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and now I'm running the game under HDR. So, this monitor offers a very basic HDR experience. I'm not going to spend too long on this section. It doesn't have any VESA Display HDR certification, although if you do like to think of things on that kind of level, it's really very much Display HDR 400 level stuff here. The monitor doesn't include any local dimming, it just keeps the backlight at a set level. As I explore in the best settings and the OSD video, there's nothing you can really configure of note under HDR. You can change the sharpness if you really want to, but you can't change the brightness, anything like that. I measured 391 nits brightness under HDR. Doesn't matter what's being displayed, that's what it shows. It doesn't have any sort of dynamic contrast either, so when there is a lot of darker or medium to dark shades as there are now, it still keeps the backlight at a very strong level, the entire backlight. So you can see the IPS glow coming in rather strongly because of the high brightness level. So yes, 391 nits isn't particularly impressive by HDR standards at all. It's actually a bit below the maximum I recorded under SDR. And another thing is that you can't adjust the colour channels, which is quite normal under HDR, but in this case I probably would have liked to be able to, because it was similar to under SDR where by default it had a cool and green tint. In this case I measured around 7200K and there was a bit of a green tint. Your eyes do adjust to this to some extent over time, but I still like to be able to balance things closer to my preferred 6500K and without the green tint. But as I said, not an extreme tint, just a little nitpick of mine. So the brightness of the outside area there, even on the brightest HDR models, they don't reach their peak luminance here, but they do sometimes have a more eye-catching look than this model does. It looks just reasonably bright, but then again, the darker scene there, or the darker area of the scene there, doesn't look really dark, and actually the camera adjusts it so it looks a bit nicer on the video than it does to the eye. To the eye, this really looks quite flooded. There's an obvious lack of depth. There are some advantages under HDR in that 10-bit colour reproduction can be used. As I mentioned earlier, the bit depth that's used on the monitor itself depends on the refresh rate you set. So at 240Hz, it's actually GPU dithering that's being used to make up the 10-bit processing. But as I said, the end result is very similar, so I don't see this as a reason to reduce the refresh rate of the monitor. Having said that, if you have a bit of bit depth insecurity and you really want to know that the monitor is doing everything itself, then you can set it to 200Hz or below. And arguably under HDR, where the focus is more on visuals and you're probably going to be cranking up the graphics settings, perhaps you're not going to be getting above 200 frames a second anyway. So I like to dive into the water here. This is a scene which can look pretty spectacular actually on some HDR monitors, I'd say. On this one, it doesn't, unsurprisingly. It looks quite sort of flat, really. The glint of light there isn't as bright as I've seen on some models, and the light streaming from above isn't either. Enhanced nuanced shade variety because of the 10-bit colour processing. So you do get finer gradients for that light and the mist over the water, and it also affects the darker shades. You get an enhanced nuanced variety there, but to be completely honest, it really is something which would have to be accentuated by superior dimming precision than what you have here with exactly one dimming zone. That's the entire backlight being controlled at the same time. And certainly the depth of those medium shades and the shadow details there, they're just not as deep as they should be at all. Just to quickly revisit that scene I showed you in the contrast section, now I'm running the game under HDR, and this just reinforces how really unatmospheric dark scenes look. You can see a lot of IPS glow, and yeah, I mean, it's exaggerated a little bit by the camera. I'd say to the eye, a bit more like that, but either way, it just looks flooded and doesn't look deep and atmospheric at all. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'd just like to talk about the colour reproduction, as that's another aspect of HDR. As a reminder, the colour gamut of this one, 96% DCI-P3, a bit of extension beyond that in some regions. Unlike under SDR, under HDR the game developers have DCI-P3 and Rec 2020, a very large gamut in mind. So ideally, the monitor will cover a lot of Rec 2020 and a lot of DCI-P3, so this one does offer good DCI-P3 coverage, but it would be lacking on Rec 2020. RCA seems to have put the gamut to pretty good use actually. They've got some good vibrancy where vibrancy is warranted, or decent vibrancy, but just looking at some of these medium shades like the trees in the background there is definitely a lack of depth, but that isn't related to the gamut, although a wider gamut could actually help inject a bit more vibrancy here. It's really more about the lack of dimming precision. So the backlight again is just at a high level all the time. It doesn't give the kind of look you're supposed to get under HDR. But because sRGB isn't the target now, Lara's skin looks more appropriate, and some of the more muted shades that should look more muted do. The earthy browns look more neutral as well. They don't have the same kind of reddish brown or orangey brown push that they had before. The fire looks quite vibrant as well. Doesn't look overdone. I'd say it looks a bit overdone under SDR, although it does depend on which fire you're looking at, because some of them are quite sort of dominated by whites and yellows, and under SDR they tend to look decent anyway. Some of them have more oranges which converge on red, and some rich yellows which verge too much on orange, etc. But anyway, under HDR things are mapped more appropriately there. And the purple and blue of these towels as well have reasonable pop to them, not as good as I've seen on some models. Same with the berries there. But again, the lack of dimming precision and also the fact there isn't massive Rec 2020 coverage, that does go against this monitor in terms of its vibrancy. But I would say that I've used many monitors under HDR which have a worse gamut than this, and for various reasons will just produce an image I would describe as perhaps washed out or faded or lacking vibrancy. Whereas here I wouldn't really describe it as washed out, although the vibrancy could still certainly be better. So overall, HDR on this monitor, it really isn't something which you're going to be using all the time. It's not something which is in any way clearly better than SDR. It isn't. You've got locked high brightness, and the brightness isn't very spectacular by HDR standards. There's no local dimming. The colour gamut and the colour performance is all right. Actually, the sort of overdone look under SDR, some will actually prefer that. But HDR still gives a different look to things. It's something which you might want to use for a bit of variety from time to time, but nothing more. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor is a 240Hz monitor. I've got the game running at 240 frames a second. This high frame rate, high refresh rate combination brings with it two main advantages. compared to a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. It improves the connected feel, which describes the precision and the fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world. This is also aided by low input lag. In this case, I measured 2.1 milliseconds of input lag, so that's a good low level. It certainly indicates a low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel. So even sensitive users should be just fine with that on this one. The other advantage of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it reduces perceived blur due to eye movement. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, which covers this in more detail if you're interested. But basically, most of the perceived blur you see on the monitor is linked to your eye movement, and that's strongly linked to the refresh rate of the display at an equivalent frame rate as well. The other important piece of the puzzle is pixel responsiveness. That also affects perceived blur. There's a photography technique explored in that article called Pursuit Photography using Blurbuster's Test UFO. And I'm just going to show you some pursuit photographs from this monitor at 240Hz. So you can see there are 4 different overdrive settings: off, low, middle and high. There's also a reference screen shown for the final column. That is the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QX. It's a few years old, but it's still a decent performer. It's another 240Hz IPS model, so it's good to benchmark against that. You can see that there's a certain amount of powdery trailing, as I like to call it, behind the UFO, more so with off, a little bit with low, less so with middle, a lot less so with middle actually, and gone with high, but there's some overshoot, inverse ghosting, which replaces it. So you can see bright trailing behind the UFO, and it's a bit colourful in places. That's overshoot. There's a bit of that with the middle setting, and for some transitions not shown here, which I'll explore a little bit later. There's some more noticeable overshoot than shown for the transitions in this test. But even so, middle is pretty well optimised, I'd say, and actually the reference screen is more similar to the RCA using its low setting. So yeah, they push it pretty well with middle without being excessive with the overshoot. The optimal setting, of course, depends on your own overshoot sensitivity. Some people might be particularly sensitive to overshoot, so they might actually find low nice, even at 240Hz, or similar high frame rates if they're using VRR, and I'll come on to VRR later. Or some people might find high tolerable because they're not particularly sensitive to overshoot. For me, though, I did find the overshoot overbearing with the high setting, and for some transitions it was really very eye-catching, so I prefer middle. I know some of you prefer numbers. So I've also done some response time testing using OSRTT Pro, little response time testing tool that a few other reviewers used. Just be aware that different reviewers will use different methodologies and different measurement standards, so you can't always directly compare measured response times. But I use the same RGB10 tolerance and indeed the same tool that TFT Central uses, so you can actually compare these numbers to their numbers directly, but be aware that they have their own color coding system and I use my own color coding system. But anyway, this is with overdrive set to off. Average initial time, that's the important thing to look at, 5.68 milliseconds, and of course the actual measured response times in the table there, they're all initial times. So with the off setting, it's not super slow, but it's not particularly fast either. But there is no overshoot recorded, which is good to see. Moving up to the low setting now, the average initial time has dropped from 5.68 milliseconds to 4.63 milliseconds, and just generally things are sped up a bit. There is a little bit of overshoot introduced, but just a very little bit recorded here, and that's why I feel we can push things a bit further. So up to the middle setting now, average initial time is now 3.68 milliseconds, so that's a significant drop from 4.63 with the low setting and 5.68 with the off setting. And you can see a lot more green or slightly golden shades on this graph than there were before, less intense orange and red. There's still some weaknesses, particularly for transitions starting with 255, which is white, or basically just bright shades if you're observing games more broadly. And I will give some in-game examples of this kind of thing, but these are what I would call high contrast transitions, where you've basically got mixtures of very bright shades and significantly darker shades, where you typically do see weaknesses even on IPS models. VA models will show more significant weaknesses than this though. So overall, pretty competent performance in terms of the response times. In terms of overshoot levels, as I mentioned, there is some overshoot, but it's not super widespread and it's not extreme overshoot, but it is moderate to high for some transitions. The high setting then, that reduces the average initial time from 3.68 to 3.08 milliseconds. So not a massive improvement, but a bit of an improvement. However, the overshoot is significantly stronger now. There's a lot of red there. And this is why, to the eye, on a broad range of transitions, I was finding this a bit bothersome. So I do, again, prefer middle, which does offer a good balance, in my opinion. So that analysis is pretty extensive, really, but I do like to talk a little bit about what I see in the game. So the weaknesses, again, they're quite on the minor side. There's a bit of perceived blur in places, particularly for where it says motor trial there with the white icons as well, or the white text. So that's some of the slower transitions performed here, particularly where there are darker shades in the background, like that rag there. So a little bit of powdery trailing, as I like to call it. And you see that as well with the joins in the rock and the much brighter shades surrounding it. A little bit of weakness there. So yeah, I mean, you don't get kind of OLED level clarity, but actually as far as 240Hz models go, this one's pretty competitive using its middle overdrive setting. This one's actually pretty competitive using its middle overdrive setting, for those who like pretty snappy pixel responses without a lot of overshoot. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5 now. This one has a lot of darker shades, so some of the high contrast transitions are more common now. The game's running again at 240 frames a second or close to that. So yeah, there's a bit of powdery trailing in places, just adding a little bit of perceived blur, not an extreme amount. For the makeshift roof there, for example, there's a little bit of that going on, the flag post there as well. If I go in here, I can see some lovely white against a very dark background. Torturous transitions here, but even then, there's not smeary trailing or anything that I describe as heavy powdery trailing, just a bit of powdery trailing. Again, reflecting what was measured and what was shown with Test UFO. The monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate technology. You can use adaptive sync, and that allows you to use AMD FreeSync, as well as NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. So you can use G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort. AMD FreeSync is more flexible. You can use HDMI or DisplayPort. So VRR technologies, they keep tearing and stuttering at bay, keeping the frame and refresh rate synchronized with one another where possible. The range of operation is 60 to 240 Hz according to my measurements with my NVIDIA RTX 3090, according to what I observed with my RTX 3090. But the monitor does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, so when it went below 60 frames a second, the refresh rate would shoot up to a multiple of that. So for example, if the game was running at 50 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 100 Hz, which also keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. I've now got the game running at 120 Hz. And you may notice, and remember I'm using the middle overdrive setting still because that's my preference, you may notice an increase of overshoot. I can certainly notice that by eye. It's more eye-catching. There actually really wasn't much overshoot to speak of, which is why I didn't really talk about it with 240 Hz. Some traces in places, but it's really much more noticeable now. The refresh rate has dropped. But my advice would be, if you're spending a lot of time here, then just use the low setting. That does massively reduce the overshoot. And the pixel responses are still competent for 120 Hz. If your frame rate's fluctuating a lot and you're really very rarely above 200 frames a second, you might like to just stick to the low setting anyway, just for the lower overshoot, and you still get decent pixel responses. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So some more pursuit photographs, but this time with the monitor set to 120 Hz. The reference is set to 144 Hz, that's just because I didn't happen to take pursuit photographs with that screen at 120 Hz, but it's only a slight difference. But here you can see with the middle setting here, yes, you can see some overshoot with Test UFO as well. It's stronger with the high setting. Low setting dials that down a lot. There's a little bit of shadowy trailing, or dirty trailing as I like to call it, with the low setting, mainly for the medium background, which is the middle row. The off setting does get rid of that, but it also introduces more powdery trailing. So I do consider low optimal at 120 Hz, as I mentioned just before. So yes, but depending on the overshoot sensitivity, the off setting may make sense, or you may prefer... So yes, depending on overshoot sensitivity, you may prefer off, but I think low is better balanced. So let's just focus in on those settings a bit more. So this is off at 120 Hz. So you can see no recorded overshoot. So it's an initial time of 5.83 milliseconds. So yeah, I think we can do a little bit better. So the low setting does do better, drops that to 3.96 milliseconds. There's more green on the graph as well. That's always nice to see. And this actually just gives a pretty competent 120 Hz experience. But yes, there is a bit of overshoot for some transitions, mainly with some medium to brighter shades involved. But it's not extreme overshoot. So I would recommend trying this out, and if you really don't like the overshoot, then do consider off, but I think low at 120 Hz works pretty well. So back to the experience on the game, compared to 240 frames a second, yeah, there's a drop-off in connected feel. It isn't as good as you'd expect from the significant drop in frame rate, which VRR technologies can't do anything about. There's also an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement, and that's also reflected with the UFOs, where the UFO itself, the object, was sharper and a bit more detailed at 240 Hz compared to 120 Hz. I've dropped things down to 60 frames a second now, so the monitor's running at 60 Hz. I've actually just changed that to 62 frames a second just to make sure that LFC isn't activating, because then the monitor will shoot up to 120 Hz instead of roughly 60 Hz, which is what I actually want to show. So I'm using the low setting still, but now the overshoot is more noticeable. It's not extreme overshoot, but it does persist longer on the screen, so it is more noticeable. So this is where the offsetting may make some sense if you just want to completely eliminate that. Probably the best example of the overshoot actually is the sort of dirty trailing around the lamp there. You should be able to see this in the video, sort of this dirty halo. So again, you might want to use the offsetting if that kind of thing bothers you. But let's look at this in more detail. So now the UFOs are significantly more softly focused, indicating a significant increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. There's also that trailing to consider behind the UFOs. And as I've just said, off eliminates the overshoot. Low does have some overshoot, and that gets stronger and stronger as you go up. So I would consider either off or low optimal at 60 Hz, depending on your preferences for overshoot. And if we compare to the reference screen, the FI27QX, that performs quite similarly to the offsetting. It's perhaps a bit between off and low really, but isn't too far from off on the RCA. So again, with the off versus low settings in mind, let's look at some response time data. So with the off setting, no recorded overshoot. The response times are perfectly decent for 60 Hz. They're not perfect, but they're not bad. The requirements for a good performance are massively reduced compared to 240 Hz and significantly reduced compared to 120 Hz, so you can really get away with lower acceleration levels. 5.83 milliseconds initial time, quite respectable for a 60 Hz performance. Using the low setting, it becomes a bit complicated because there's a different performance if you're looking at a static 60 Hz refresh rate versus 60 Hz achieved using VRR. So the top graph there is static 60 Hz, bottom graph, or bottom graphs I should say, 60 Hz under VRR. So the response time has dropped from 5.83 milliseconds with the off setting now to 3.99 or 3.88 with VRR disabled and enabled respectively using the low setting. But it's really the overshoot levels which have increased quite a bit more when you're using VRR versus just a static 60 Hz refresh rate. So what I was showing you in the game before, that was 60 Hz achieved under VRR. It's quite a moderate amount. It's not an extreme amount of overshoot, but it's more than I'd like. And again, the dirty trailing is probably the best example of it. Quite a bit for the makeshift roof as well. Just turn overdrive off as I have now, and as demonstrated with test UFO and the measured response times, it offers a decent 60 Hz performance. Yes, you get a little bit of extra powdery trailing, but it completely eliminates that overshoot, so I find it more pleasant. So that's a bit confusing, so it certainly isn't a single overdrive mode experience if you consider what I've just told you. So for higher refresh rates, or the highest refresh rates of the monitor, I liked middle. 120 Hz I said I liked low. 60 Hz I said I liked off. And of course, between these values, then you sort of just subjectively decide which you prefer. However, the low setting, I think, is probably a good one to stick to if you're playing a wide range of games and your frame rates are all over the place, various different frame rates, because it will offer you a reasonable experience throughout the refresh rate range, even if it's not truly optimal. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting, MPRT. So in the review earlier, I gave you some data from that saying it was locked at a brightness just above 100 nits, which to be honest is going to be a no-go for some people as it is. So it's very restrictive. But strobe backlights aren't something which you can really demonstrate in a video because you just start to see a bit of flickering. You can't actually see the benefits that it brings because it's all related to changing the amount of time your eyes spend tracking motion and reducing the perceived blur due to eye tracking. It changes the monitor from sample and hold to impulse type. However, pursuit photographs are a lovely way of exploring MPRT and strobe backlight settings in general. So here you can see the monitor tested at 120 and 240 Hz. You can use MPRT at 120 Hz and above on this monitor. Intermediate settings weren't tested, but they're really just somewhere between these two, so it's just good to see the extreme ends, I feel. You can change the overdrive setting, but I'm just sticking to what I consider the optimal setting for 120 Hz, which is low, and 240 Hz, which is middle. The same optimal setting as with MPRT disabled then. So you can see results with MPRT off and on at 120 Hz and at 240 Hz. So looking at 120 Hz, you can certainly see a bit of an improvement to the clarity of the overall object with MPRT enabled, but You might also notice some trailing in front of the UFO, particularly for the top row, for the dark background. And that also has a bit of a red fringe to it. That is because of the KSF phosphors used with the backlight. They're quite common on wide gamut monitors unless they use a quantum dot solution. And they have a slow decay rate, which leads to this sort of red fringing or colourful fringing in places. And you can also observe this when you move your eyes. So if you're not familiar, when you use a strobe backlight setting, it does flicker the backlight on and off at a frequency that should be matching the refresh rate of the display. Some people are sensitive to flickering, so that alone can be a bit bothersome, but with KSF phosphors you can also see these colourful flashes even when you're just moving your eyes around, particularly when you're observing brighter shades. I'm really sensitive to this actually, and I find it quite bothersome, to be honest. With this one I'd say it wasn't extreme. I found some monitors with KSF backlights more annoying than this one, but this was still a bit annoying for me. But anyway, the sort of repetition and the fringing you can see with Test UFO, it's broadly termed strobe crosstalk. You can also see some overshoot behind the UFO. At 240Hz you can see a nice overall bump in clarity with MPRT enabled versus disabled. The main UFO, you can actually count the notches now, which is nice. The segmentation is nice and distinct. It's actually more distinct than it appears in the photo. The black lines are really nice and sharp and dark and well defined. And the strobe crosstalk now appears behind the UFO, and some of the colourful fringing appears hidden, but be under no illusion, depending on the transitions being performed, you can still see that to the eye, and I do find it distracting. And the strobe crosstalk in general, it is stronger further up on this screen, and remember that the dark UFO is displayed just a bit above centre, so it is a bit higher up the screen than the other UFOs. This is still considered the central region of the screen, which your eyes will spend most of the time looking at when you're observing motion on the screen. And I did in general, when I was using the strobe crosstalk setting in gaming, find the strobe crosstalk a bit strong for this sort of upper central region. So overall, I didn't really love the setting. It's not the worst I've seen. I've certainly seen models with more strobe crosstalk and various other artifacts than this, but with the restriction in brightness, you can't use it with VRR active, plus the strobe crosstalk and the KSF phosphor flickering, I didn't love it. And I just preferred the non-strobed experience, particularly using VRR. So, to wrap up then, in terms of the styling of the monitor and the overall feel, I didn't feel it really lived up to its premium name. Bit wobbly, and the stand base as well, I didn't love it. It was a bit of a desk depth hog. It was also just quite wide as well. I just prefer simpler stand designs, but I know quite a few gaming monitors do go for these more ostentatious, if you like, designs. But either way, I actually prefer a nice bit of coated metal on my so-called premium monitors. Good ergonomics though, height adjustment, tilt and pivot. You can't swivel the stand left and right though, but there are 100 by 100mm VESA holes at the back if you need to use them by detaching the included stand. Now, speaking of the included stand, I should also mention I didn't love the way that the stand base attached with 3 screws that you have to screw in with a screwdriver. Usually there's a thumb screw, which is used on monitors. I've assembled and disassembled many monitors in my time, and it's usually a bit quicker than with this one. But not always. Sometimes you actually have to screw the entire stand to the screen itself with 4 screws. So it could have been slightly worse, but either way, I just think that the design could have been a little bit better thought out. The contrast performance of the monitor, typical IPS performance there. Typical level of IPS glow, typical IPS contrast, dropped a bit below 1000:1 using my test settings because of the adjustments I had to make, but a bit above that depending on the settings you use. Nothing spectacular. The screen surface, light to very light matte anti-glare. Personally, I quite like that compared to stronger matte screen surfaces. Less layering in front of the image, better at preserving vibrancy and clarity. Less likely for there to be a sort of hazing of the image from ambient lighting as well. But that's always something you have to be a bit mindful of regardless of screen surface. HDR performance, just very quickly going to summarise that because I had brightness in my mind there. Not impressive by HDR standards at all. No local dimming, so it really fails on that front, but that's really quite typical for 240Hz models at this price range. The colour gamut was quite generous. 96% DCI-P3 put a decent use under HDR, but that's really just part of the equation and certainly not the complete picture. Not the most dynamic or vibrant HDR experience I've had on a monitor. The colour performance under SDR, well, you're using that native gamut of the monitor, then it gives strong vibrancy, strong saturation. Some people are going to really like this look, but there wasn't an sRGB emulation mode on the monitor to tone things down. The consistency was strong. So shades in the middle of the screen versus peripherally or elsewhere on the screen, similar representation. That's also useful for colour accurate work, but with that in mind, I would certainly recommend calibrating this one because there aren't any sort of colour gamut clamps specific to DCI-P3 or sRGB. And if you want to work in the Adobe RGB space, remember that you've got 92% Adobe RGB coverage, so you do have some under coverage. It's sort of borderline for work within that colour space. Ideally, you would have more than that. The responsiveness of the monitor, pretty good really. Low input lag, good responsive 240Hz experience, minor weaknesses but nothing extreme, and not a lot of overshoot using its optimal setting there. Speaking of the optimal setting though, there wasn't what I would consider a true single overdrive mode experience. I found I was constantly wanting to shift my overdrive setting depending on the refresh rate range I was at. Middle I like to use for 200Hz plus, between roughly 100 and 200Hz. This is very rough. I liked low more, and below that, and especially approaching 60Hz, well, I preferred off because of the overshoot becoming a bit annoying even using the low setting there. But VRR itself was a decent implementation. There weren't any particular issues with VRR flickering, which I sometimes note on monitors. It's not particularly common on IPS models, but some do actually still have this flickering, but it's more common on OLED and VA panels. This one didn't have that issue and didn't have any other particular issues of note using VRR. The strobe backlight setting was okay, but very restricted because of the brightness levels. Around 100 nits, it's going to be too dim for some people, and actually potentially too bright for others, just a lack of flexibility, not ideal. And some artifacts, KSF fringing, strobe crosstalk, that kind of thing. A little bit more than I'd like to see, but not extreme. So overall, I feel I've got quite mixed thoughts about this one. I do think it's a capable monitor, and I do feel that it's done quite well in terms of responsiveness overall and 240Hz responsiveness, and that's really going to be a key factor when most people are considering this kind of monitor. A monitor which I would compare this one to, the close competitor to this one, is the MSI G274QPX. The two monitors are similar in many ways. I haven't actually used the MSI myself, but based on reliable test data from others, there are a few differences to be aware of. At time of review, the RCA's recommended street price is around $430, whereas the MSI, sometimes that's closer to $350. So there's a significant difference, but prices do fluctuate, and especially at this time of year when I'm recording this, they do tend to go all over the place. So the MSI sometimes is closer to $400, the RCA also closer to $400, a bit below, maybe $380. It's really hard to say and hard to recommend them based on price. Let's just say they're similar prices, but the MSI is generally slightly cheaper. I also prefer the MSI's design because of the more solid and compact stand. It has an sRGB emulation setting, which is important for some people. It also has a downsampling mode, can receive a 4K UHD signal. It has marginally stronger contrast, around 1300 to 1 versus 1100 to 1. Depends on the settings you use, but very roughly speaking, it's usually about 20% better than the contrast on this. Difficult to quantify, and in practice they're still both very much IPS models. There's nothing dramatic in the difference between these contrast experiences. And the MSI uses a BOE panel that has a stronger matte screen surface, so better glare handling, what I'd call relatively light, whereas the RCA has a light to very light matte screen surface, and what I believe is an AU Optronics AHVA panel. So better glare handling on the MSI, yes, but somewhat more layering in front of the image and more potential hazing from ambient light. So some advantages for the RCA: 90 watts of power delivery via USB-C. That's nice to see. Although, as I mentioned in the OSD video, I would have liked to see KVM auto switching, because they do include KVM, but you need to manually adjust the input and the USB source, which is quite easy to do with the joystick, to be fair, but it's better if you can assign these things in advance and it's all done with one click. The RCA has a lower minimum brightness as well, around 27 nits versus around 108 to 120 for the MSI. For those who are quite light sensitive, the RCA is actually a much better choice. The RCA also offers superior pixel responsiveness, particularly for high refresh rates such as 240Hz. The optimal middle setting on the RCA, it's similar to fastest on the MSI, but with significantly lower overshoot. The MSI does offer a fast setting, which is a bit toned down, and that reduces the overshoot to similar levels to low on the RCA. But if you compare these two settings, the MSI has comparatively sluggish pixel transitions. So basically the RCA is just a bit faster without incurring an overshoot penalty. So I think both of these monitors, they can offer a very enjoyable experience. I do feel that I would have liked to have seen a bit more polish on the RCA. I've sort of mentioned a few things like the lack of sRGB emulation, overall build quality, no 4K UHD downsampling, the standard pricing being just a touch on the high side. But you might look at these things, or you might look at the price of the monitor and think, I don't really care about these things, in which case the RCA might well be a nice monitor for you. I also think it's a pretty solid initial offering from RCA. It is their first monitor, or their first of 2 monitors, which they released at the same time, the other being a 165Hz variant without USB-C. But at the moment, at least, they're very much US-centric, so if you're watching this video and you're not based in the US, this monitor is probably not going to be even available to you, or not easily available. In that case, well, the MSI is going to be the natural one to consider. So that's really all there is to the RCA Evolution Premium. In the description of the video, you can find a link to other videos we've done with this monitor, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.